Зажглася заря расписная.
Выхожу за околицу я, с добрым утром, сторонка родная, дорогая отчизна моя, с добрым утром, сторонка.
Христос воскрес! Good morning, brothers and sisters. We welcome everyone to our prayer service this Heritage Day 2007, and especially we welcome all of our guests.
The Doukhobors originated in the south of the Russian Empire in the late 17th century and early 18th century. They rejected the Orthodox Church, the worship of icons, the priesthood, and the sacraments and religious dogma of the Orthodox Church in favor of a more simpler, individual-based religion. The Doukhobor pacifist beliefs reached a pinnacle in 1895 when, on June 29th, which was St. Peter's Day, celebrated by both Russian Orthodox and the Doukhobors in Russia, they gathered together all their firearms and weapons of violence and destruction, heaped them onto bonfires fueled with kerosene, and burned their arms. This was a seminal event in Doukhobor history and was known as the burning of arms. The persecutions that followed the burning of arms following 1895 soon caught international attention thanks to the likes of Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, who published information about the burning of arms and the persecution of the Doukhobors to the international community. By 1899, the situation of the Doukhobors in Russia had become untenable, and thanks to the efforts of Leo Tolstoy, who through the promotion and sales of his book Resurrection, as well as the Friends, or Quakers in England and America, helped finance the mass immigration of 7,500 Doukhobors from Russia to what was then the northwest territories of Canada. It was the single largest mass immigration in Canadian history at that time.
Leo Tolstoy was negotiating with the Quakers. The Quakers were in touch with the British government. The Britannia was ruling the waves at that time. Canada was a colony that they were trying to build up and inhabit.
They were not exempt from military training in Russia. So they thought the next best thing would be to leave. But there was nobody offering them a place until, Canada offered a place where they needed strong shoulders to work the land, and to our good fortune that this happened 100 years ago. We are very, very fortunate to be in this country.
But this year, because we were lucky enough to have the guitar, we are expecting tons and tons of people, so we are baking tons and tons of bread, which is also one of our major fundraisers. And this guitar is made up of pieces from every territory and province in Canada. They asked us for a piece of the Doukhobor elevator in Veregin here that was actually built by the Doukhobors, and that's why we're getting the guitar, is because of that piece of the elevator.
The pieces from the grain elevator ended up in two spots. One is right here on the rosette, and this sort of orangey piece here is from the grain elevator. And then it's also, if you look on the back, all of this here is Louis Riel's schoolhouse. The two dark strips, two on the outside, are from a door frame from the Centre Block of Parliament in Ottawa. And then the piece from the grain elevator is the very, very center strip that runs up the middle of the guitar. The goals of the project are really to get people to think about Canadian history and to know more, to see the connections between us, to use music as a vehicle for talking about history.
Гори много разгуляних, гори много разгуляних.
During their first years in Canada, the Doukhobors lived a communal lifestyle under the formal name of the Christian Community of Universal Brotherhood. They established over 60 communal villages. They lived, prayed, and worked in these villages in a communal fashion.
The main settlement is actually about 12 miles north of here. That's where the village of Atradne developed and grew up. And one of the first things was they built this a prayer home and a Peter Veregin, a residence similar to this. But that was even larger and more beautiful, you see. That was built about 1902 or so.
Following the death of the last hereditary Doukhobor leader in 1887, Peter Lordly Veregin was proclaimed the leader by a majority of the Doukhobors living in the Caucasus.
Actually, Peter was exiled to Siberia. When they all came, he was in Siberia yet. So his mother and his older brother kind of took charge of everything.
Finally being released in 1902, he rejoined his followers who had already at this point immigrated to Canada. It was a tearful and joyful reunion between the Doukhobor leader and his followers.
Наш великий управитель.
He was an extremely well-educated man among the Doukhobors, who at that time were primarily illiterate. He was also a man of great charisma and was able to fill a whole room or a whole area with his voice and his presence. And it was that charisma which carried over following his arrival in Canada in 1902. The tradition of having a residence and administrative center for Doukhobor leaders is a tradition that stems back to the Caucasus, and throughout the 19th century it was known as the Sirotsky Dom, or Orphans' Home. It was a place where orphans and people of little means were housed within the Doukhobor community. The original residence in Atradne, built in 1906. It lasted until 1916 when it was unfortunately burnt down as a result of arson. It was after the burning of that original residence that in 1917 efforts were made to rebuild residence for Peter Veregin here at its present location in Veregin.
This Veregin home has been built after the original one that burned down. And so this prayer home was built on this site. They chose Veregin because Veregin was closer than the old original site to the railway. The design of most of these buildings can be traced back to Russia, and you can find these designs in buildings there with the wraparound verandas and the decorative pieces on there.
In Veregin, the two-story building is a remarkable construction, partly for the care that went into making the metal fretwork. The metalwork, the metal arches around the balconies themselves, the wooden structure itself is very, very plain but very beautiful in its simplicity.
And then the metalwork and the decorative stuff on this building was done by John McQuinnan. Veregin here, where the house is built, was where the administration was all run from for the CCUB community. It was communal living at that time, so he was more or less the overseer of the whole community in Saskatchewan and in BC at that time. So whenever he was in this area, this is his residence. The room that we're in now is the original room where Peter Veregin or his son or some guests, whenever they came over, they slept. This would be the original bedding and bed of Peter Veregin, and the carpet hanging on the wall here is usually they hung on the wall because the walls were cold in wintertime, and if you leaned up against the wall, it'd be cold this way. You leaned up against the carpet, it was kind of protect yourself from freezing your body against it. This particular room that we're in right now is more or less of a kitchen setting for where food was prepared and mostly brought out of here into the dining room, which is the next room over there, or some people ate right in this small little kitchenette. Okay, this would probably be the more or less of the dining room where meals were served. A sitting room where they discussed probably stuff about their visit here with different dignitaries and about the settlement and how it was going, and had meetings in this room on this table. Here we are. We're probably in the sitting room where after having a lunch you'd probably sit down and relax and be prepared for the next day. Peter's office would more or less be probably in this room also. That's what they were telling me before, and probably he had a desk here that he sat at. And some of this furniture in this room, probably the only one that made locally is this table here because of the carving, and it would have been done by somebody here in the area.
The residence of the leader was ultimately not just a home, but an administrative center, as well as a spiritual center. It was on this very veranda that many a time Doukhobor leader Peter Lordly Veregin would address his followers below him every Sunday following a prayer service or a millennia.
Today is the day that we're going to be listening to the Canadian guitar. So we're pretty proud of that. And we've got some musicians here behind me.
Jerry and Peter and myself, thank you. And it's nice to have a chance to play this wonderful instrument, and I'm sure everybody else will enjoy it as well. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Being of peasant stock, were primarily an illiterate people. Singing became a primary form of expression within the Doukhobor culture.
Men used to sing as they worked, and women got together as a group. They'd be sitting knitting or, getting some handwork done, and they'd sing. Some of the hymns have beautiful, beautiful sentences in them that really hit home when it comes to living a simple life. It tells you. So if you learn it by heart, it's with you all the time, you can sing it to yourself, and it sort of gives you encouragement.
In the Orthodox Church, there were icons of Jesus, of Virgin Mary, and other biblical figures, and we refused to worship man-made objects.
We celebrated the Tolstoy statue, but Doukhobor people are not statue people. But because he did so much, that's why we feel it's a good idea to honor him.
Because of their beliefs, the Russian Orthodox clergy referred to them derisively as Doukhobors, which in Russian means spirit wrestlers. The Doukhobors, in their characteristic fashion, took that label and adopted it, changing its meaning to refer to those who worship for and with the Spirit of God.
We have just lay people. There is no priest or no minister or no reverend. It's just a person who is able and volunteers to do so.
We say prayers, we sing hymns, and that's the way our funerals are carried out.
We are now on the main floor of our prayer home. This is the room where usually prayer services were held. Also general meetings were held to discuss about the communities.
The Doukhobor beliefs or way of life can really be summed up in two well-known models of the Doukhobors. The first one is toil and peaceful life.
Toil and peaceful life means, like, we don't mean toil your finger to the bone or work your finger to the bone, but means toil honestly. Don't ride somebody else's back. Toil means honest work.
The second motto, which is the welfare of the world is not worth the life of a single child, really underscores the pacifist beliefs of the Doukhobors. And that is that regardless of the ends, violence, warfare, and killing are under no circumstances acceptable.
The bread is the staff of life, and the water is the spirit of life, and the salt is the essence of life.
And that's our tradition. In Russia, when they burnt all their weapons, they were exiled, and there was a lot of bandits roaming, robbing. And they knew they were coming. The Doukhobors knew. They put white shirts on, robes, came out to the leader of their bandits with bread, water, and salt. They said, "What's this? Are you hungry?" They said, "Well, yeah. Get up, sit down and eat." They sat down, the whole bunch of them. They had lunch. The leader stood up. He says, "You don't touch these people." They rode away. That's an example how much power it's got.
И в отчизне наш Спаситель.
Prior to the 1890s in Russia, the Doukhobors were meat eaters. It was only in the late 1800s, under the influence of Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, that they began to consider their treatment of animals and arrived at the conclusion that it was a sin to eat the flesh of an animal.
I never tasted meat till I was 20 years of age, till I met her. And eventually I got to like her and went on a wiener roast. I ate one wiener the first time, one. And I thought that it changed my life altogether. Early in the morning, this morning, I jumped out and looked in the mirror. Nothing changed.
Heritage Day celebrations at the Doukhobor Heritage Village are times when anyone and everyone is welcome to come and celebrate the history of not only that site and the buildings, but the accomplishments of the people. And one of the celebrations that we went to on one of the Heritage Days had a reenactment of pulling of a plow by the Doukhobor women. They collaborated as they did on almost everything in terms of the work that had to be done. And at the Heritage Day ceremonies, they celebrate this collaborative effort. And the ladies dress up in their historic dress. Everybody celebrates by reenacting the pulling of the plow.
The Doukhobors lived a communal lifestyle. All property was owned in common. All agricultural work, the clearing of fields, the cultivation and harvest was all done jointly as a community. All profits were pooled in a common treasury. In exchange, everybody was cared for, and the wealth was distributed at a communal level.
Gardens and fields were outside, and you probably have seen lots of pictures of them. It's just one alleyway, one long main street. And there were houses on each side and gardens and barns at the back. Well, the barns were generally communal, but each one had their own individual little garden and their own home. The Doukhobor women were together. They were in the community. Their homes were side by side. If one was ill and the children were, they were looked after. And they weren't lonely.
This is a museum setting now, but on these very grounds, this was called melnitsa, which is Russian word for the mill. They brought in grain. They ground into flour. They had a brick factory here. There were stables, blacksmith shops, carpenter shops. There were bathhouses. There were residences here.
It was in 1907 that the Doukhobor community was split apart between those known as the independent Doukhobors, who favored a more individualistic lifestyle, who rejected the leadership of the Doukhobor leader, Peter Lordly Veregin, and his communal vision in favor of the ownership of individual homesteads. The majority of independent Doukhobors continue to maintain their Doukhobor faith. They kept their language and their culture, but chose a different way of life, similar to that of other Canadians. In the decade that followed 1907, the majority of the communal Doukhobors resettled to British Columbia. Following the death of Peter Lordly Veregin in 1924, however, without his strong leadership to guide the organization, the community did go into decline. Combined with that, you had the Great Depression, which affected everybody in the 30s, to result in a significant debt, which was acted upon with the foreclosure by the Sun Life Company of the Christian Community of Universal Brotherhood. The CCUB as we knew it ceased to exist. That those belonging to the communal way of life became themselves independent Doukhobors, often buying out former community lands and living in farming like independent Doukhobors.
The only original buildings on this site is the White Prayer Home, the long concrete machine shed, and also the elevator that was left. That's the only three community buildings of the CCUB era that were left after the 1939 breakup of the communities. And they were brought back to restoration because of a few people that were interested in restoring and keeping the prayer home.
I was involved with museums right from the beginning. My dad and then me. Some people came from Regina. They encouraged us and got the ball rolling. They told us to preserve the buildings. 10 years there'll be nothing here. And the Veregin Doukhobor Society was the first one that got it going. And there was a person just out of here that bought it. He's a Ukrainian, but he had sympathy with the Doukhobors. Time came to demolish this building. He didn't have the heart to do it. So he notified the Doukhobor Society, please buy it, take it back, preserve it. At that time, that was in the 1940s.
It's designated as a Saskatchewan Provincial Heritage Site, and just last year declared as a National Historical Site by Parks Canada. On an average year, we get around 3,500 people during the summer. Doukhobor societies are still allowed to use it. They do have usually monthly services here in the summer months, but it's a museum, and we try to keep it as a museum.
I really find it interesting how we have like a whole recreation of his house, and it's got all kinds of like real Russian stuff and like old clothes, and my grandma would walk me through like the whole village and point stuff out to me and be like, oh, they used to use this for this, or this crate is all they used to be able to bring out. And I really thought it was interesting how not only could I see all this stuff, but she could tell me like little stories that she knew about everything. So I found that really cool.
That brick building came from a village north of Arran, Saskatchewan, and it was moved here. And the brick building is typical of a building that you would find in any Doukhobor village. It is also a prayer home, and it's similar to every one village had one like that, and they use it as a worship area. The one part is a worship area, and the back part of that prayer home, again, you would find a room there that they used for Veregin whenever he was in the area. It's important to restore these buildings because they are of heritage of our ancestry, and these are original, so you want to restore original buildings.
One of the issues that faced the community and the province, because this is a provincially designated structure, is how to upgrade certain aspects of it from a safety perspective while retaining the original historic fabric of the building. And the Doukhobor Prayer Home, like many buildings that are of the historic era, really don't meet modern fire code standards. And the balconies are the means of getting out of the building, down the stairs, and away from the structure in case of fire. And the objective was to buy enough time for anyone who's in the building to get safely out. And to do that, the fire commissioner and the consultant architects embedded a sprinkler system in the stud cavities of the walls so that it became like a water curtain and drenched the balconies. The balconies were entirely dismantled because that's where most of the weathering occurred on the building. And what that meant was taking the tongue and groove flooring up, replacing any of the joist system that had been rotted over time, redoing the post construction and the balcony railings that were deteriorated, and reassembling it all so that it looked like the original building.
A lot of ethnic and minority groups in Canada have faced the pressures of assimilation, and the Doukhobors are no different. Growing up in the 40s, 50s, and even the 60s, you had at that time not only the pressures to assimilate and become part of mainstream Canadian society, you also had the Cold War, when it was not a particularly popular time to be of Russian or East European ancestry. It was only in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, with the rise of multiculturalism, where you have a generation of people who are now in their 20s and 30s who grew up without those prejudices and who are in fact proud to be of Doukhobor ancestry.
We just hope that it carries on. The younger generation, maybe they're just not around right now because the elders are here. But I know our parents thought maybe the same thing would happen, but here we are through all the years, so hopefully maybe our children will step up.
Or we hope that, like, our granddaughter is interested, and she comes every year for Heritage Days, and maybe as time goes on, the young people will decide to come back.
And it's kind of like ourselves. We kind of took a break for 40 years, almost, and then we started to get involved again.
You always hope for that, but whether they will or not, that is something we have no control over. So we'll carry on and do the best that we can and pay tribute to our forefathers for bringing us here for as long as we can do it.
Пароходы стоят на по-русски у причала.